Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to this next edition or the next episode of the Tiger Avon Rescue Budget Hill Climb Blaster build. We'll have to work on the title. It could be a bit shorter.
Welcome to Avon Rescue with Chris Hollier, your place to discover your passion for kit cars, car building and restoration. Are you building a kit car or low-cost 7 and can't figure out the best way to configure your dash and gauges? If so, then you've come to the right place. This is going to be another meat and potatoes episode because Chris is going to show you how he's building a budget-friendly competition dash, and stick around to the end to see a how-to lesson on building a custom Aero screen. Now let's go visit Chris in the shed.
What we're going to do this time, as I mentioned last time in a little update, is we're going to go in more depth on the dash, why we did it, how I made the Aero screen, because this one, I've had quite a few requests on that, how we did it. And just to explain generally why, and we'll concentrate just on the dash area for this episode. I'll be doing other things. I've got a lot of the wiring in now, main battery cables are in, engine bay wiring's done. But let's just concentrate on this area. We'll just do a how-to this time as well on the metal forming on the wind deflector, so you can see more of what's going on rather than just subsequent updates. I'll take it all apart and then we'll talk through the whys and the how-tos. Yeah, and you can see what short work Matt made of it, and that's a bit of an old Allen key with the end cut off, just so that you can undo them all rather than twiddling an Allen key all the time. There we go. Now we'll start taking the rest of it apart. Right, now to get access to the rest of this, I'm just going to pop the steering wheel off because it makes it easier to get to everything. And then you'll see it's all made in separate panels. One for the battery isolator, one for the secondary instruments, one for the main instruments. This was all about the thought for motorsport. If something goes wrong, you need to get easy access in here and be able to take stuff apart in the pits without having to crawl upside down and try and get your head up underneath here. So this is all very much considered and why we did it in 3 separate panels. So there's speedo, rev counter and warning lights. And there's ancillary gauges. Now I know there's no wiring on it at the moment, but you can see there's a multi-plug on some of these. And what I'm going to do is put the whole panel on its own multi-plug. So if I want to take it apart, undo the screws, pull it forwards, undo the multi-plug, and I can get to everything easily and quickly. Right, so this one's just got the indicator switch in it. And you can see how they're all made. It's just flat aluminium pieces with some carbon fibre self-adhesive wrap. And when you try and tuck it over the edges, get yourself a hot air gun or a paint stripper gun and warm it before you pull it over. And then what that does is it softens the plastic and it allows all these corners to be, you can mould them into shape with your thumb then as it's going round. If you don't do that, what tends to happen is it'll be on there for half a day, then it starts to peel back up again because the plastic is trying to return to its original shape. So use a hot air gun, warm it, and then push it over. So that's the indicator switch. Now hopefully I can reach over just far enough to get this one out. Now it's not going to come right out because it's got the battery cables attached to the back of it now. But you can still see the principle that I can get it to there and I can reach anything when I need to. Okay, for the next bit, this is the main former for the top of the dash. It's actually a piece of 15mm thick alley which came out of a skip, which gave me a nice big chunk to be able to use. But it's held on, whereas I've drilled and tapped the top to be able to hold the Aero screen onto it, I've drilled and tapped the bottom and put some studs into the bottom of it, so it's nice and strong and rigid, and it's held on. One. That's 2, and you can also see there's a nice big spreader washer on the back so it doesn't put too much point loading on the fiberglass. and that's how it lifts off. Now, if you saw the last video, you'll see me making another one of these as the little infill piece, because this is set back from the main dash face. We needed to bridge that little gap, and that's what this piece was for. And if you look underneath here, you can see it's held on with just a couple of little dome-headed bolts. I've got the shift light coming through it. This is the adjuster for the shift light cut-in point and the light itself. And you can see around the back, I've had to modify the housing for the shift light to clear the Aero screen because it was pointing too far outwards. Right, so now we've got all this off, you can see how much of the dash I've actually had to cut away to make this work. Because it's not structural, it still needed to be reasonably stiff, even though it's not structural. So what I've done is I've got a bit of inch by inch aluminium right angle, and I've riveted it, you can see part of it here, underneath the lower edge of the dash all the way across, and it comes right up into the corners here. This has put the strength back in the middle of the dash so it doesn't end up all floppy. And when all the panels are screwed onto it and the Aero screen screwed onto it, everything gets nice and stiff and it all stays still. Okay, so now we've got the bits off the car, we're going to have a slightly closer look at what's what, where I can show you how it's all been made. Now let's start with the main former for the top of the dash. If we look round the back and underneath, you can see it's one great big chunk of aluminium. I'm very fortunate that I've got a big 24-inch throat bandsaw with a metal cutting blade in it. So this was all cut out on the bandsaw, and then the profile on the top, because as this sits on the car, the Aero screen goes back at an angle. So this had to be then angled with a flat wheel and an angle grinder to get it the right shape. You can see there's quite a lot of work in here as well. This was quite fun because I can't get the bandsaw in normally. So if you look just here, there's a little tiny split. So I cheated like hell, cut in with the bandsaw to make all the inside of this disappear. And then when this little bottom plate goes back on again, because it's got a bolt either side, that keeps that nice and rigid and still. Because it's 15mm thick alley, it's thick enough to drill and tap really comfortably. So your bolts go into it easily there, and these are the studs drilled and tapped into the bottom to hold it onto the top of the scuttle. It's the same carbon fibre wrap, and again warmed up as it comes around the corner to make sure it stays put. So that's the main former. Now let's have a look at the other gauges. The main gauge is nothing fancy, it's just a piece of flat aluminium. But if we actually have a look at the clocks, these came out of a Triumph Dolomite, and they didn't used to look like this. They had white needles, and there was no colour in any of these bits. So I got onto eBay, found some sticky back plastic and a scalpel. Took the bezels off the front and took the glasses out because I wanted to clean them anyway because they looked a bit old and grotty. Put a bit of sticky back plastic on the needles, some coloured sticky back plastic in here. Repainted the bezels in satin black rather than the grotty chrome they were originally, just to try and make them look more interesting. Because of the budget, I bought the whole dashboard for 50 quid for all the dials and everything I needed. If I'd bought that as individual new instruments, every single one would have been £50 per gauge. So you can see the difference it made. With a little bit of effort in the evening with a scalpel and the sticky back plastic. I've done the same here on these ones. I've covered over the Smith's logo with a little tiny instrument logo or a function logo so you can see which one's which. And I've put some little coloured segments on the gauge and made the needles red. I've got a total investment in all the modifications in this is probably £1.50, and to make them look different. Again, it's a sheet of ordinary flat aluminium with the carbon fibre wrap over the top. But what I will show, my son made these little bezels to angle the instruments. If I show you there, you can see how much of an angle's on them. To angle them towards the driver so they work better. And we started with a prototype in fluorescent green, lovely. And all they are, he actually is a very good CAD designer, drew them up, and he's got a small scale 3D printer. And these are printed in ordinary PLA, just as an example. We were going to try and do them in nylon to make them stronger. But as you realise, when the instrument's in here, it slides in and sits on this little recess. And when it's pulled in round the back with this clamp, there's no load on that at all, it's not going anywhere. So PLA was absolutely fine for it. Even though it's reasonably fragile, it worked fine for here. If you were going to do these for an IVA test, it wouldn't be rocket science to introduce the correct radius on that corner as well. So you could take non-compliant gauges and turn them into compliant gauges with a little surround. Angled or not, you just need somebody who's got a little 3D printer and the enthusiasm to have a go. The switches along the bottom here. I bought one of these aftermarket Chinese race car switch panels because the switches, to buy it as a complete unit, was cheaper than I could buy the switches individually. So the ignition switch, the fuel pump switch and the start button all came out of that panel, and these ones are just other ordinary aftermarket toggle switches. These three are closest to the driver because these are the three you need to get to if it all goes horribly wrong. So what we've done is the ignition switch is up for on and the fuel pump is up for on. So if it all goes a bit Pete-tong, all you've got to do is do that and everything shuts down. And then the battery kill switch is just over here, so you can switch everything down while you're still strapped in. So that's what the gauges were all about. It's as much about budget and function as it is about look. Okay, now let's change it up from what I've normally done, and rather than just showing you what I've done, I'll show you how I've done it this time. As I've mentioned a couple of times, a lot of people are asking about this wind deflector and how I made it. It's cardboard aided design, good old CAD, but my version of. When you use cardboard, it works very similar to metal in a lot of ways. You can't put a curve this way and a curve that way in a piece of cardboard because it will crease. So the cardboard will show you what the metal wants to do when you want to pull it round here. Because this is a single plane curve, you can do this over your knee. This is really easy. That again is a single plane curve in here. You can bend it over your knee. So forming that part of the shape is really easy. But you then got to hold it down somehow and hold it on. And if you look, I'll show you in a little while when we're doing the other one, there's a 20mm wide flange around the outside here. As you can see, this comes down at an angle, that's sitting flat. I can't just put a bolt through here because otherwise it's going to pull that down, it's going to look horrible. So I've got to flatten just a flange out around this edge so that this can come down and intersect with there properly, and I can put a bolt through it and it won't crease. If I point over to this side a little bit, hopefully you can see as we come round the corner, the angle between here and here gets less and less and less until ultimately it's running parallel to it. So we don't need much of a flange around there. But on the steepest parts up here, that's when we've got to do the most forming. So using a piece of card to get your shape right, it's cheap, it's quick, it's easy. You can stand back, you can paint it if you want to, and then stand back 20 foot and see if you like the look of it. You can invite all your mates around to come and say, what do they think of it? Do you think it should be changed? But it allows you to try different things. I went for this asymmetric size or style where this side is bigger and deeper than that side. That's because I'm old and I like 1930s race cars, and I used to do that a lot. Because this is going to be for motor racing most of the time, it's going to have one person in it most of the time. So it doesn't need as much wind protection over here as it does over here. I could have gone to Tigers and bought their pre-made GRP stroke carbon fibre wind deflector. But because I've had to move the steering up by 2.5 to 3 inches to get my legs underneath it, it wasn't high enough. And it would have stopped at this height. So this is the reasoning behind me having to make my own one and make it this size. So what we're going to do, now you've seen the cardboard section, I'm not going to remake the whole thing, but I'll show you the techniques I've used for forming the shape around the outside, and then we can refer back to the other one and you can see how it was done. Okay, so now we've moved into the fabrication workshop on the side, and we'll have a look at the, oh, I've got the microphone's working. We'll have a look at how we actually form the aluminium panel for the wind deflector. If I show you the underneath, you can see it's only a standard piece of aluminium, there's nothing fancy. From this side you can see the size of the return flange, and you can also, if I show you this bit here, see that it fades away to nothing just here. If I come around on this side as well, for exactly the same reason, it fades away to nothing here. Because as it's sitting on the car at this angle, as it comes around the side of the scuttle, they become the same angle, so it doesn't need this flange. Right, if I get a bit of cardboard and rest it on top, just to show that I'm not bullshitting you, there you go. It's the same shape, I made that from that. So the cardboard is step one. You can lay that straight on your flat sheet of aluminium and cut round it. It's literally that simple. And that will give you the outline shape you need. From here, there's a few more little crafty bits you need to get involved with. You can bend this shape over your knee. Don't try and use the corner of a bench, otherwise you'll get ridges. Use something nice and soft like your leg or your knee or something, and slowly start to form the middle bend first, so that it sits down in the middle of that main dash former. Then you can slowly start to form these round. You're going to be doing this in about 5 or 6 stages, so don't try and get too perfect with the first bit. Because once you've got your shape on here and you start to form this flange, it will change this curvature as well a little bit. So don't be too pedantic on the first little bit. Don't drill any holes in anything yet. Just leave it plain aluminium. If you can give yourself a little guide mark, if you can rest this back on the car and on the main former, and just mark a little line where the front edge is and the front edges. And also mark yourself a centre line, so that each time you take it off, bend it a bit more and put it back on again, you know where to aim. Because if you don't mark those, if you move it a little bit each time, you'll keep bending and have to keep reshaping it. Okay, so what we're going to do now, I'm not going to try and form another whole wind deflector because I only need one, but I can use a piece of aluminium offcut just to show you how I've done the basics, and the rest of it is just more of the same. So what I've done is used my cardboard template, and I've cut the same shape out of a piece of 1.6mm aluminium. Now, I'm going to add a little bit of health and safety in here. I'm not usually a great advocate of it, but from very uncomfortable mistakes in the past, when you're cutting out pieces of aluminium, pieces of any metal, put a pair of gloves on and get a file after you've cut it and file all those nasty little burrs and splinters off the edge, because they hurt. They really are uncomfortable. So take the couple of minutes, don't get too impatient, and just clean up the cut edge. You'll find you can cut it with a jigsaw, you can cut it with tin snips, you can cut it with a nibbler, whatever you like. The one thing I'm a bit wary of with tin snips, as you're cutting, as you get to the end of the blade, it leaves little ridges all the way around at the end of every cut. So if you can use a saw of some sort rather than snips, you'll have a bit less to do to clean up along that edge. It's not the end of the world, just needs a little tap down flat again. But it's one of the things that if you can find a way of doing it without snips, you'll save yourself a little bit of time. So you can see now, I've done about half of it, this piece here. So if you can spin round just a little bit for me. So it's 1.6mm alley, stick it over your leg. Don't try and do all the fold in one go. Work your way backwards and forwards. And in a couple of seconds, that's all it takes. You'll find it a bit easier doing the middle fold going the other way than I will at the moment, because you'll have all the rest of it to work with. But if you do find you need to do a fold on an edge like that, again, don't try and use the edge of the bench because you'll get ridges in it. But what you can do is stand it on here and use your thumbs and push down. That way you get a nice gentle radius in there without too many creases if you take your time. So we'll have a little bit more curvature in the top edge. And you can see we're now fairly similar to what's there. Right, so the next thing we need to do is work out how wide this flange needs to be. I've used little M6 bolts to hold this down. So I found the flange itself is ideal. There you go, 18mm wide. Nice part about these little calipers, there's a little locking wheel on the back. And if you lock that tight, you can then use the jaws to scratch you a lovely even line. All the way around. Hopefully that's just about showing up on camera. Let's give it another little go, just to make it a little bit deeper. Okay. Anyway, if I move it around a bit, hopefully you'll be able to see roughly how wide I've gone on there. So we've now got to start forming that from this angle up here. One of the things it's going to do as we try and fold this bit up, it's got to try and actually shrink the metal a little bit along this edge as it's coming round. No, sorry, it's not. It's shrinking in here. It's stretching as we're coming along here. I don't want to lead you astray. So on this return, it will shrink. On this return, because of the metal's moving that way, it needs to get bigger. Now at a push, you can use these wide-jawed mole grips to form on the line and slowly start to form it up. So you can see the principle there, but I'll show you another way that I've done it because I've got a little bit more machinery. You probably won't have it, but at least it's nice to know how. Right, this little bit of kit here is called a swage roller or a Jenny roller, depending on whereabouts you are in the world. It's designed primarily for rolling different shapes into the edge of panels. But because this upper wheel has got a square corner on it, I can use that to start the crease all the way along my line and get a nice even line with it and do away with these little wobbly bits I'm getting when I was using the mole grips. So the idea being is it goes in there, it clamps down there, and you lift the panel up as you're winding it through. Now there's a little depth stop at the back here, which I'm using to make sure it stays the same distance from the edge of the panel all the way. Now a lot of you American guys will have motorised versions of these. Yeah, I wish I had one as well, but hey ho, this is what I've got, this is what I'm going to use. Right, so if I stop there and come back out, you can see now we've started to form the crease really nicely along here without all those edges, all those little wrinkles. So I'm going to carry on and come round to about here, because this is where our flange needs to stop and come in parallel. Right, okay. So now you can see what it's started to do. So if I come here, you can now see what it's started to do. It's started to shape the edge up. Now the other thing, and an added benefit that you won't appreciate because you're not in the workshop here with me, is how much stiffer it's made this. And that really has now been rather than being a springy old bit of aluminium, that's now become quite rigid. So our next step from here is to go back, pop it on the car, and then start finessing this little ridge. Okay, so now we're back out with the car again, and this is first fit. So don't expect perfection too early on, work up towards it. Now you can see I've marked my little lines, as I was saying previously, on the car, so every time I put it back on here, I come back to exactly the same place again. Otherwise it gets really confusing. Now you can see I've got a gap underneath here, and it's touching here. So I've obviously got far too much bend here, and not enough there. So we can start to just gently tweak it with fingers until it starts to come in a little bit closer. And we need more curve in this bit here. And a lot more curve on this edge. Right, the other thing it's showing me is that just here where it's touching, that flange needs to bend up some more. So I'm going to go and get a pair of pliers again, and I'm slowly going to start to form that up a bit more. Right, so I'm going to go back to using the wide jaw mole grips. And we're going to come in just here and slowly start to form it round a little bit more. Here we go. This is looking nice and parallel between here and here. But here, Still needs quite a lot more in it. Okay, now it's looking better. Still got a tiny little bit more here I want to put in, and then we'll add a bit more curvature generally through here. Right. I'm going to stick this down over my knee again, so bear with me a second. Right, there we go. Now you can see we're actually getting quite close here now. That's fitting there, that's fitting there. I'm going to put some more in here. It's coming along, still need some more just here. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, see, we're starting to bring this edge down now, and you can see the last place it's touching is here. That's where we need to start introducing, keep pulling the bend in there. This is where the alignment marks really come into their own, so I know I'm going back in the same place. Every time we're getting a bit closer and a bit closer. Yep, and we're down to about here now, so we're definitely making progress. Okay, yeah, everyone's moving down a bit more. Now we're down to here. Right. As you can see, it's not rocket science. It's just patience, keep looking, use your alignment points all the time, use your alignment points. So from here, we've now got to start really getting this groove in the right place. We're going to use a little piece of pointed wood and a hammer, but before we do that, we're going to have to protect the top of the gel coat. Otherwise, this edge will dig in and it'll form lots of scratches. So I'll protect this up and then I'll show you the next bit. Right, so the next thing we need to do is to make this a nice, neat, refined line. If we just try doing it with a hammer, we're going to end up with bruises on the metalwork all the way around. Because the hammer head is round, it's not going to go in there properly. So what we're going to use is a piece of wood. It's only a piece of old firewood cut to a point. But because it's soft enough and narrow enough, it can sit in that groove. We've protected the GRP with this piece of card, and I've transferred my measurements and the bits of tape that were on there onto the card as well. So I know I've still got the position right. Now what I can do now is put that in there. I now know that I'm forming this flange to exactly that shape, because that's what it's sitting on, that's what's supporting the edge. So I'm going to work my way all the way across. Now if you look just here, can you see it's lifted the edge up? Because it's actually formed the shape a lot better. We've now got this line sitting down properly onto the fiberglass, and it's lifted that edge up. So what we can do now is use the side of it and tap it down on there. Now if I push down on here, can you see how nicely now that fits all the way around there? Around this corner here, I'm going to try and tap this in a little bit more now. And you can just see the shape is forming really nicely around there. I'm not going to spend hours trying to get this one perfect. I'm trying to show you the technique rather than the finished one. You can see the finished one. I'll bolt that back on again in a minute. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Piece of softwood, piece of hardwood's actually a bit better, but softwood will do perfectly happily. Before we can get the absolutely final shape, we're going to need to start fixing this down. Otherwise, every time you tap, it moves. As you can see, it's still got a little bit of spring to it. So we're going to need to start making some fixing holes through it and anchor it in, I don't know, 4 or 5 places to hold it still, so that when we do our final forming, it comes to the actual shape we need. Right, so next process, as we just said, was to make the holes. Plot out where your holes are going to be before you do anything else. Work out what size screws you're going to use, how many you're going to need. Start from the end and then plot them out distance-wise all the way around and plot the whole piece out with all the measurements. If you don't get them equal all the way around, somebody will come up to you at show and say, oh, look, they're nowhere even, are they? So take your time, do that bit really carefully and get them even so that there is no room for anybody else to criticise. If you're a bit OCD like me, you can't do it any other way. You have to make them even, otherwise you can't live with it. So what we're going to use to make the holes is these things. It's called a joddle and punch. It's in two pieces. Let me just make that come down here. This side is a hole punch. This side is a thing called a joddle. I don't know if you can just about see if I put my finger behind it. There's a little step in there. And its function is if you want to put a new lower piece on a door skin or something like that, it'll actually punch or fold a little step in the panel so you can overlap one panel over the other. But we're not using that today, we're just going to use the hole punch. And it's a very clever little tool because that top section spins round like that, so it can be either one. But we're using just the hole punch. And when I've got my hole positions, pop it on the edge. It's got its own built-in depth stop, so it puts all the holes in exactly the same place, in from the edge of the panel. No drilling, no messing, just a really nice, neat little hole. Not big money either. Very worthwhile investment if you're going to do a fair bit of this, because it just makes lovely, neat holes. There's no burr on the back. If you drilled the holes, you knew you were going to get a burr on the back, and you'd have to spend all the time deburring it afterwards. So that's our fixing holes. If you line your marks up again now, you can mark through your fixing holes. Into the top of the panel, and you know where you've got to drill your holes in your panel. I like to use things called riv nuts or threaded inserts. You can hold this on with self-tappers, nuts and bolts, anything you fancy doing. The reason I like riv nuts is I can put them in and out 20 times, quickly and easily. And if I manage to mess the thread up on one of them, I can drill it out and I can put another one in. If I use self-tappers, once I've screwed that on once, if I pull the thread, my only option then is to go for a bigger self-tapper. Then I have to change all of them so they all match. So these threaded inserts, they take a little bit of getting used to. They're not technically difficult. It's just the amount of time it takes to put them in, countersink them nice and flush, and get used to using them. I won't go into too much detail on those at the moment. We can cover those later. So you can see everything now, when it's pulled down, is all going to pull in nice and tight. Okay, so in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one we made earlier. You've already seen it, obviously, but you can see now the direct comparison between what we've got here and the shape I just made in the aluminium. The only difference, this one's had the self-adhesive carbon fibre wrap put over the top to make it better than just a bare sheet of aluminium. It's not rocket science, it's patience, some basic hand tools, getting the idea in the first place and then taking your time. Don't forget to protect the fiberglass when you're working with it, because once you've scratched it, you know, unless you're going to paint it, and there's a different matter. So I hope you've enjoyed what we've done and you've learned something from it. If you haven't, okay, awfully sorry. We'll try better next time. But you can see now how I've made this one. And I think we'll wrap that one up for this episode and say, okay, hope to see you again next time. Cheers now.